The Vanishing at Ashwood Hall, on the outskirts of the small coastal town of Greystone, hidden behind a wall of ancient oak trees, stands Ashwood Hall, a sprawling estate that has stood for more than 2 centuries. Locals tell stories of its past, of aristocrats, visiting dignitaries, and grand celebrations that lit up the night sky. But in the autumn of 1912, Ashwood Hall became the center of a mystery that would puzzle historians and investigators for generations. The guest list. That October, the wealthy shipping magnate Charles Whitmore invited a small group of guests to spend a long weekend at the estate. The purpose, he said, was to celebrate the unveiling of a priceless painting recently acquired from Europe. The guest list was short but prestigious. Eleanor Whitmore, Charles's wife and noted art patron. Dr. Samuel Pritchard, historian and expert in maritime artifacts. Margaret Vale, a celebrated novelist. Inspector Edwin Clarke, a retired Scotland Yard detective. Harold Bennett, an art dealer from London. An ominous detail. The guests arrived on a Friday afternoon, each greeted by the butler, Mr. Finch, and shown to their rooms in the East Wing. The painting, Charles explained, would be revealed in the Grand Hall the following evening. But as the last carriage departed, a heavy fog rolled in from the coast, swallowing the driveway and muting the world outside. One guest later recalled thinking, "It felt as though the hall had been cut off from the rest of the earth." The unseen watcher that first night. Several guests reported hearing footsteps in the West Wing, a part of the house Charles insisted had been closed for years. When Mr. Finch checked, he found nothing but locked doors and covered furniture. But just before midnight, Margaret Vale claimed she saw a shadow move across the grand staircase landing. It was tall, motionless for a moment, and then gone. Narrator, measured, suspenseful. Morning came to Ashwood Hall, wrapped in fog, the lawns pale and glassy with dew, the sea somewhere beyond the trees, breathing like a sleeping giant. Today was meant to be the grand unveiling, a private showing of a priceless painting that Charles Whitmore had shipped across an ocean. But before the first bell rang for breakfast, something else was discovered. A guest was missing, and so was the painting. Breakfast without a chair. At precisely 8, the dining room doors opened. Mr. Finch, the butler, announced the menu in his calm, clockwork voice. Silver covers glinted. Coffee steamed. One chair at the long oak table sat empty. Inspector Edwin Clarke noticed first. "Where is Mr. Bennett?" he asked, setting his napkin aside. Charles Whitmore frowned. "Harold is a late riser. Mr. Finch, would you fetch him?" Mr. Finch inclined his head and left. The guests tried to resume the morning small talk about weather, the fog, the coastal road washing out last year, but the silence kept returning to that empty chair. 5 minutes later, the butler reappeared, a thin crease in his usually unreadable expression. "Mr. Bennett is not in his room, sir. His bed is undisturbed." Eleanor Whitmore set her teacup down. "Undisturbed?" As though it was never slept in, madam. A gaze passed around the table like a quiet wind. And then a second piece of news came from Mrs. Dalrymple, the housekeeper, who hovered at the threshold, pale and tight-lipped. "Sir, the Grand Hall display case is empty." The Grand Hall. They gathered beneath the dome ceiling, where last night's velvet curtain still hung. Drawn closed, Mr. Finch pulled the rope. The curtain fell aside, and the glass-fronted easel stood bare. No frame, no gilded cartouche, no canvas. On the parquet floor, a single thing glimmered, a brass label, the placard that should have rested beneath the painting lying face down. Inspector Clarke lifted it, inspected the edge, then turned it over. Soft metal clink. Narrator. The name was engraved in tidy capitals. The stranger at sea artist? Unknown. Circa 18th century. A note in smaller script. Acquired from the Albright Collection, London. Eleanor clasped her hands at her throat. Charles, how could anyone? Charles Whitmore shook his head, voice low. The grand hall was locked by midnight. Only Mr. Finch and I have keys. The windows are sealed for the fog. The casements are bolted. There is no way. Margaret Vale, a novelist, stepped closer to the easel. No broken glass, no splinters. Not even a scratch on the floor. Dr. Pritchard adjusted his spectacles. Then the painting left the hall the same way it entered, by someone who knew how to open the case without damage. Inspector Clarke let the placard slide into his palm. Two matters, then. A vanished picture and a vanished man. The West Wing footsteps the night before. Several guests had heard footsteps in the West Wing. A portion of the house officially closed. Inspector Clarke requested it be opened. Door latch clicks. Hinges groaned faintly. Dust breathed up from long corridors draped in sheets. Faded portraits watched from shadowed walls. At the end of a passage, a narrow door led to a small balcony overlooking the front drive. Its bolts were rested into place. The dust intact. Narrator. No one had come or gone that way. But on the corridor runner, a faint smear of pale ash caught the inspector's eye, thin as a sigh, leading toward a linen cupboard. He drew the door open. Shelves, neatly folded covers, and on the lower shelf, a clean rectangle where something had rested recently. "Mr. Finch," he said softly, "what would be stored here?" "Display drapery, sir. A protective cloth used when we transport delicate items within the house." "And where is it now?" The butler's hesitation lasted only the length of a breath. "Missing, Inspector. Bennett's room." They searched Harold Bennett's room next. The bed was unturned. The suitcase lay open, clothes still neatly packed. On the writing desk, a half-written note that began, "Charles about the provenance you mentioned," then ended mid-sentence, the ink faint where the pen had lifted. Margaret Vale traced the paper's edge with her eyes, not her fingers. "He's careful with words. He wouldn't leave a sentence unfinished." Eleanor looked around, unsettled. Was Harold the sort to wander at night? Charles shook his head. "He's the sort to lock his door. Dealer or not, London trains caution into a man." Inspector Clarke crouched at the threshold, studying the lip of the doorframe. No splinters, no force. He ran a finger over the keyplate and found the faintest smear of something oily. He sniffed. Not oil, wax. He glanced up. "Mr. Finch, who last handled Mr. Bennett's door last night?" "He locked it from within at 11:30, sir. I saw him do so. I waited to collect the keys for the West Wing inspection. But he did not give me his. Guests keep their own keys. And this morning, the door was unlatched." Staff and shadows, Inspector Clarke asked that the staff be gathered in the small morning parlor. They arrived in quiet order. Mr. Finch, the butler, measured, precise, a ledger in human form. Mrs. Dalrymple, the housekeeper, nervous around silence, hands folded tight. Ivy, the youngest maid, eyes red from little sleep, glancing often at the floor. Rowan, the groundskeeper, boots damp, cap in hand, smelling faintly of wet leaves and salt air. Clarke's questions were gentle but clear. Had anyone seen Mr. Bennett after 11? Had anyone heard movement in the night? Had anyone seen the display drapery? Ivy spoke first, barely above a whisper. "I took hot water to Miss Vale at 11:30. On my way back, I heard something by the west corridor, like cloth dragging." She swallowed. "I thought it was the wind at the tapestries." Rowan shifted his weight. "I walked the terrace at one storm, was coming up from the sea. All windows shut. No footprints in the flower beds under the grand hall. The soil would have kept them if there were." Mrs. Dalrymple wrung her handkerchief. "I checked fireplaces at 10. The west salon hearth was warm, though the room is closed. I assumed Mr. Finch had aired it." Mr. Finch's brow lifted, just slightly. "The west salon has not been used in months." The room tightened around the words. A room that should be cold, They went together to the west salon, dusty, sheeted furniture, a grand piano asleep under linen. The hearth was black and tidy. No fresh ash in the grate. Dr. Pritchard frowned. Yet the bricks still hold warmth. Inspector Clarke knelt, tapped 2 bricks along the side jamb with a knuckle. Hollow clack, then a duller thud. His gaze sharpened. He pressed the second brick. A panel no bigger than a ledger slipped inward, revealing a narrow cavity, clean as a cupboard, running behind the hearth. Inside, nothing. But the stone was faintly warm, and on the sill, a grain of sea salt, glittering like a frozen tear. Passage, Clarke murmured. Old houses keep old habits. Charles looked genuinely astonished. I grew up here. I never knew this existed. Narrator. If there was a passage, it ran unseen behind walls, between rooms, perhaps toward the cellars, or the cliffs. The clock that stopped, they returned to the grand hall to begin a room-by-room survey for hidden panels. On the way, the inspector paused at the base of the staircase clock, an old long case that had been ticking faithfully through 2 centuries. Now its pendulum was still. Eleanor touched the glass. It was working last night. Clarke opened the face. The weights hung uneven. The minute hand was wedged slightly against the numeral 12. He turned the hand delicately. It freed with a soft tick. Stopped at 12 exactly, he said. Or someone said it that way. Why stop a clock unless to mark a time or to mislead? A thread to follow back in the grand hall. Mr. Finch produced a small ring of auxiliary keys used for interior locks. Clarke asked to see which opened service passages and secondary doors. Ivy, still pale, lifted a hand. There's a pantry door off the west corridor. It sticks in wet weather. Sometimes I go the long way through the still room. She hesitated. Last night, someone had rubbed wax along the latch. It didn't stick at all. Clarke glanced to the smear he'd found on Bennett's key plate. Wax again. What's missing, besides the painting? Mrs. Dalrymple, mustering courage, said, We keep inventory of display cloths and transport coverings. One is missing the larger velvet drape used for canvases. I discovered it at dawn. Dr. Pritchard thought aloud. A velvet drape would protect a painting from damp and conceal its shape if carried along a corridor. Margaret Vale turned to the inspector. And if someone used that secret cavity to move unseen? Clarke nodded, eyes distant with thought. Then we're looking for who knew the old routes and who planned for silent doors. Closing the house, Charles gave the word. No one would leave the estate grounds until Mr. Bennet was found. The gates would remain shut. The telephones, at the inspector's instruction, would be kept free for calls to the Coast Watch and the local constable. The fog pressed its face against the windows like gray wool. Somewhere in the house, a door settled with a soft sigh. Narrator, quietly. A man had vanished, a painting with him. There were no broken locks, no shattered glass, only small things. A worn brick, a grain of sea salt, a smear of wax, and a clock that would not tell the truth. After sealing the gates and notifying the local constable, Inspector Clarke turned his attention to the cellars beneath Ashwood Hall. Old houses, he knew, often carried more history below the ground than above it. The cellar doors were heavy oak, secured by iron bolts that screeched in protest when Rowan, the groundskeeper, slid them free. The descent and narrow stone staircase spiraled down into shadow. The air cooled with each step, thick with the scent of earth and coal dust. Mr. Finch led the way, holding a lantern high. Its glow revealed rows of wine racks, bins of preserved fruits, and a long wall lined with closed storage rooms. The first sign, halfway down the main cellar corridor, Clarke stopped abruptly. On the dusty stone of the fourth stair, a clear impression of a shoe print broke the otherwise smooth layer of settled dust. It was sharp-edged, fresh, and the tread pattern was unfamiliar, neither staff boots nor the polished soles of the guests. Clarke. This print was made last night, possibly after the dust had settled for weeks, maybe months. The toe pointed upward, toward the main floor, as if whoever made it had been leaving the cellars in a hurry. A velvet clue near the base of the steps, caught on the jagged point of an old nail in the wall, was a small fiber of deep blue velvet. Clarke rolled it gently between finger and thumb. It matched the description Mrs. Dalrymple had given of the missing display drape, the one used to wrap large paintings. The bolted door at the far end of the cellar corridor stood a door, different from the rest, narrower, made of heavy planks, its iron hinges bolted from the outside. Mr. Finch said quietly, "That, Inspector, is the old preserve room. It hasn't been opened in decades." Clarke's brow furrowed. "Why bolt a room from the outside, unless you mean to keep something in?" Rowan fetched a wrench from his work belt, and with effort they drew back the corroded bolts. The hinges moaned as the door swung inward. A room that should not exist, the lantern light spilled into a space no bigger than a pantry. But instead of shelves for jars or fruit, the walls were bare stone, and the floor showed faint scrape marks, as though heavy objects had been dragged in and out over the years. And in the center of the floor, a square of wood, flush with the stone. A trapdoor. Clarke knelt, tested the edge, and found it loose. With a careful pull, the square lifted, revealing a steep wooden ladder descending into deeper darkness. A faint smell of salt water drifted upward. If this passage went where Clarke suspected, it could lead beyond the estate walls entirely, and straight to the cliffs. Inspector Clarke descended the ladder slowly, his lantern casting restless shadows along the rough walls. The air grew colder, and the smell of salt water sharpened with every step. At the bottom, his boots met damp stone. A tunnel stretched ahead, its ceiling low, the walls cut unevenly, as though carved by hand many years ago. A lantern still warm near the base of the ladder, Clarke's light fell on an old brass lantern sitting on the floor. Its wick was faintly blackened, the metal still holding a whisper of warmth. Clarke, whoever was down here was here recently, possibly only hours ago. 2 directions. The tunnel split a few yards in, one branch sloping upward toward faint daylight, the other curving deeper into shadow. On the damp ground, footprints marked the thin layer of silt, 2 sets side by side, moving away from the ladder, and another set returning toward it. One set of prints matched a heavier shoe, possibly a man's. The other, narrower and shorter, could have belonged to a woman or a smaller-built man. The cliffside exit Clarke took the upward path first. After 20 paces, the tunnel widened into a natural cavern, its mouth opening to a ledge halfway down the cliff face. Mist drifted in from the sea below. The waves crashed against the rocks with steady force. A narrow, weather-worn path zigzagged up the cliff toward the outer edge of the Whitmore estate. Rowan, groundskeeper. "I've walked this cliff for years. I never knew this entrance was here." Near the mouth, Clarke spotted another trace of blue velvet, caught in a fissure of the stone, confirmation that the missing drape had passed this way. Back into the dark, the second branch of the tunnel led deeper underground, its floor growing wetter until shallow puddles reflected the lantern light. Here, the footprints faded, but scrape marks along the wall suggested something large had been dragged through. The path ended at a heavy iron grate, rusted but still solid, beyond which the black water of a sea cave shifted in and out with the tide. If the painting had been taken by boat from this point, it could be miles away by now, and Harold Bennett with it. The decision back at the ladder, Clarke weighed the possibilities. The tunnel offered 2 exits, one to the cliffs and one to the sea. Both were risky to navigate in heavy fog, unless the thieves had known exactly where they were going. That meant planning. That meant help from someone who knew Ashwood Hall far better than any weekend guest. While Rowan and Mr. Finch secured the cellar door, Inspector Clarke returned to the west wing, the part of Ashwood Hall that had been shut for years. The rooms here smelled of disuse and time. Dust lay thick on every surface, and the curtains hung stiff with age. At the end of a narrow corridor stood a small study, its door unlocked, as though someone had been inside recently. The writing desk. The desk was a beautiful piece of craftsmanship, dark walnut, brass fittings, and a lock on the central drawer that had been forced sometime in the past. Clarke opened it carefully. Inside were loose sheets of paper, a leather-bound notebook, and an envelope containing 3 small hand-drawn maps. The maps. Each map was a rough sketch of part of the estate, the West Wing and Grand Hall, with a dotted line marking a path from the hall to the hidden west salon panel. The cellar layout, including the trapdoor and the tunnel branches. The cliffside exit, showing the zigzag path to the outer boundary of the property. They were precise enough to guide someone unfamiliar with the passages, or to remind someone who hadn't used them in years. The list of names. The leather notebook contained a list written in a neat but urgent hand. Names of past and current staff, guests, and associates of the Whitmore family. Several names were crossed out, some with a single stroke, others scribbled over so completely the paper had worn thin. At the bottom of one page, 3 names remained uncrossed. Bennett Finch Vale. The final note tucked between the last pages was a slip of paper, its edges rough as if torn from a larger sheet. It read, "Saturday moon permitting." The words were underlined twice. Saturday was today, and though the fog had swallowed the night, the moon, hidden or not, might have been part of the plan. The question, who had written these maps and notes? And why keep them hidden in a room supposedly sealed for years? If Harold Bennett's name was on this list, he might not have been a victim at all. He might have been a collaborator. Inspector Clarke found Eleanor Whitmore in the morning room, a place of soft light and long views over the fog-covered lawn. She was seated near the fire, a cup of tea in hand, watching the flames as though they might offer answers. The questioned Clarke placed the folded maps on the low table before her. "Clarke, Mrs. Whitmore? Have you ever seen these before?" Eleanor's brows lifted, and for a moment her hand paused above the cup's rim. She studied each map carefully. "Eleanor, yes, though it has been some years. My husband showed me one very much like this when we first married. He said it was a curiosity, a family relic from when the house was built." More than a curiosity, she traced the dotted line on the West Wing sketch with her fingertip. "This route to the cliff. My husband explained it was used in the 18th century to move supplies from ships without being seen. Smugglers, you know." Her eyes lifted to Clarke's. "But I never saw all 3 maps together. And I certainly never saw them in that study. That room was locked after a storm damaged the windows. Charles said it was unsafe." The last time Clarke leaned forward. "Clarke, when was the last time you saw these maps?" "Eleanor, not long before the war. We had a guest, an old friend of Charles's, from London stay for a week. He was an antiquarian, fascinated by the history of Ashwood Hall. I recall he spent a good deal of time with Charles in the library, looking at old documents." She hesitated. "One evening I passed the library door and saw the 2 of them with the West Wing map spread out between them. The friend was making notes." "A detail that matters, Clarke. Ask the name of this friend." Eleanor's answer came slowly, as though pulling it from years of silence. "Eleanor, Alistair Vale, Margaret's father." The inspector's mind moved quickly. Margaret Vale, the novelist guest in the house right now, shared not only a last name, but perhaps a long family acquaintance with Ashwood Hall's secrets. If Margaret Vale knew the West Wing passages, and Harold Bennett's name was on the list with hers, the missing painting might not have been stolen at random, but as part of a plan decades in the making. Margaret Vale was in the library when Inspector Clarke found her, standing near the far shelves, a book in one hand, her gaze distant as though the words were far less important than her thoughts. The approach clerk moved quietly, placing the maps on the broad oak table between them. "Clarke, Mrs. Vale, these maps were found in the West Wing study. Your mother or father ever show you something like them?" Margaret's eyes flicked to the paper, then back to the inspector's face. "Margaret, I've seen them, yes. My father drew them. But not for theft, Inspector. He was documenting the hall's architecture for a book that was never published." A shared history. Margaret closed her book, resting it gently on the table. "I grew up hearing about Ashwood Hall. My father and Charles Whitmore were young men together, both fascinated by maritime history. Charles invited him here often before Eleanor, before the war. The passages were a curiosity to them, a secret of the house." Her tone softened. "When I was a girl, I came here once. My father showed me the West Wing stair that leads down to the cellars. I thought it was like something out of a novel." The question of trust. Clarke's voice was steady. "Clarke, and Harold Bennett? How well do you know him?" Margaret considered. "We've met at auctions, charity events. He's persuasive when he wants something. And he always wants something. Art dealers are like that." She paused, her fingers lightly touching the edge of the map. "You think he used these passages last night?" Margaret's alibi. Margaret, for the record, Inspector, I was in my room after 11. Ivy brought me hot water. I wrote until the clock struck 12. Then I heard something in the corridor, soft, like fabric moving. Clarke, you didn't open your door? Margaret, no. I assumed it was the house settling. Her account matched Ivy's, but whether that was coincidence or careful alignment remained to be seen. That evening, a search of Bennett's abandoned suitcase would reveal a hidden compartment, and inside, an envelope addressed to no one, containing a single brass key and a shipping receipt dated 2 days before his arrival. As dusk crept across the fog-draped lawns, Inspector Clarke returned to Harold Bennett's room. The suitcase still sat open on the bed, its contents exactly as they'd been left that morning, at least on the surface. An unusual weight. Clarke lifted the case onto the writing desk, running his hands gently along the lining. Near the base, he felt a slight unevenness beneath the fabric. A careful tug at the seam revealed a narrow flap, cleverly stitched to disguise a hidden compartment. The envelope inside lay a single manila envelope, unmarked, sealed with plain wax. Clarke broke the seal. 2 items slid out onto the desk. A brass key, small and well-worn, its head engraved with the faint initials SR. A folded receipt, printed on thin paper, bearing the name of a shipping company in Portsmouth. The shipping receipt, the receipt was dated 2 days before Bennett arrived at Ashwood Hall. It recorded the shipment of a single wooden crate, marked as antique handle with care, delivered to a private storage facility not far from the coast. No sender's name. No recipient. Only the initials SR written in the margin, the same as those on the key. A link to the painting? If Bennett had arranged to store something before his visit, and that something was connected to SR, the initials might point to an accomplice or a client waiting for the stolen painting. Clarke placed the key and receipt in an evidence pouch, his mind racing through possibilities. A quiet knock. As he locked the suitcase, a soft knock came at the door. It was Ivy, the young maid, her hands twisting in her apron. Ivy. Inspector, there's something you should see. It's in the conservatory. Mrs. Dalrymple says it wasn't there this morning. In the conservatory, Clarke would find a damp footprint on the tile floor, a trail of water leading to the glass doors, and pressed against the outside of the glass, a folded scrap of blue velvet pinned with a brass tack. The conservatory was a place of quiet beauty in daylight, tall glass walls, rows of orchids and ferns, and the constant perfume of damp earth. But this evening, the space felt different. The air was cooler, and the soft hiss of rain on the roof was joined by the faint drip of water on tile. The footprint just inside the main walkway. Inspector Clarke knelt beside a single wet footprint. It was small, likely not a man's boot, and angled toward the glass doors that opened onto the east lawn. The print's edges were sharp, suggesting it had been made recently, before the water could spread. The velvet scrap ivy pointed toward the far right corner of the conservatory. There, pinned to the outside of one glass panel with a small brass tack, was a folded scrap of deep blue velvet. It was damp from the rain, but the fabric's texture matched perfectly the missing display drape. Clarke studied the tack brass, slightly tarnished, its head engraved with a tiny symbol. A compass rose. A possible signal, Clarke. This wasn't left by accident. Someone put it here to be seen from outside. He stepped into the rain and looked back toward the conservatory. From the gardens, the velvet square stood out vividly against the glass, like a marker in an otherwise uniform wall. If it was a signal, who was it meant for, and had the intended recipient already passed by? The water trail. Inside, a faint trail of droplets led from the glass doors toward a side entrance that connected to the east corridor of the house. Clarke followed it carefully, but the trail thinned to nothing halfway down the hall, vanishing near an old sideboard. A quick inspection of the sideboard revealed nothing hidden, no false back, no trapdoor beneath, but the wall behind it felt oddly cool to the touch, as if a draft was seeping through stone. Somewhere behind that wall, there might be another passage, one not marked on any of the maps found so far. That night, a sudden noise in the east corridor would bring Clarke back to the conservatory, just in time to see a shadow slip past the glass and vanish into the fog. The east corridor lay silent when Clarke returned after supper, its long rug muffling his steps. But halfway to the conservatory, a faint creak from the glass doors drew him forward. Through the panes, the fog pressed close, thick, shifting, blurring the gardens beyond into pale shapes. The movement outside, at first he thought it a trick of light, but then a shadow slid across the misted glass, tall, slender, moving with deliberate care. Clarke stepped closer, hand on the latch. The shadow paused, as if aware it was being watched, then glided sideways, disappearing into the white wall of fog. Into the night, Clarke opened the door, the cold air rushing in. The gravel path outside was slick with rain, and visibility no more than a few yards. He moved quickly toward where he'd last seen the figure, but the fog swallowed everything. Only the muffled sound of the sea carried through, a telling find near the hedgerow. His lantern beam caught on something small in the grass, a brass button, its surface stamped with the same compass rose found on the tack that pinned the velvet scrap. The ground around it was disturbed, a patch of flattened grass suggesting someone had crouched there recently, perhaps waiting or hiding. The question of signals. If the blue velvet in the conservatory was a signal, had the shadow come to collect a response? Or had they been checking to see if the signal was still in place? The answer would depend on who else at Ashwood Hall recognized the compass rose. And as Clarke would soon discover, the emblem wasn't just a random design. It had been part of the Whitmore family crest for more than a century. The next morning, a visit to the Whitmore study would reveal an old ledger of guests and shipments, with certain pages carefully cut out. The Whitmore study smelled faintly of leather and old smoke, a room of deep armchairs, heavy curtains, and shelves lined with books whose spines were rubbed smooth from decades of use. Charles Whitmore had always kept a meticulous record of his affairs, including a ledger of guests, acquisitions, and shipments to and from the hall. If there was a pattern to be found, it might be hidden in those pages. The ledger clerk set the heavy book on the desk. The first entries from the late 1800s were crisp and neat, written in the same careful hand. The more recent years were looser, penned in the styles of various family members. But halfway through the 1909 entries, the flow broke. The gap's whole leaves had been cut from the binding, cleanly, with a blade leaving behind only a narrow strip of paper at the spine. From the numbering of the remaining pages, at least 12 were missing. Clarke, quietly, whoever removed these knew exactly what they were taking. The remaining clues, the page just before the missing section, listed a shipment received from Lisbon, described simply as one trunk miscellaneous maritime effects. The page after the gap jumped forward to an entry marked Private Viewing A. Vale. No details, no description. Just the initials and date. Family crest connection in the margin, besides several earlier entries. A small compass rose had been drawn in ink. The same emblem found on the brass tack and button. It seemed to mark certain shipments, but not others. If those marked shipments all followed a similar route, Clarke might be able to trace the network behind this theft, a network that could stretch far beyond Ashwood Hall. That afternoon, Rowan would bring Clarke a discovery from the stables, a leather satchel hidden beneath hay bales, containing a second set of maps and a letter signed only with the compass rose. The Whitmore stables were a mix of fresh hay and old timber, the kind of place where every creak of the boards felt like the house itself breathing. That afternoon, Rowan found Clarke there. Holding a dust-covered leather satchel, he discovered hidden beneath a stack of hay bales in an unused stall. The satchel, the leather was worn smooth at the corners, its straps stiff with age. Clarke carried it to the tack room, where a single oil lamp cast a warm circle of light. Inside, neatly folded, were 2 more hand-drawn maps, but these were not like the ones from the West Wing desk. The new maps. The first map charted the surrounding coastline, with small X's marked at several coves and inlets. One of these X's was at the base of the cliff below Ashwood Hall. The second map was far stranger, a floor plan, not of the hall, but of what looked like a warehouse, its rooms labeled only with initials. In one corner, a compass rose had been inked in sharp, deliberate strokes. The letter. At the bottom of the satchel lay an envelope, its flap sealed only by folding. Inside was a single sheet of paper, bearing no salutation, just a short message. Saturday night, east window. Moonlight will be enough. Ring no one. Compass rose symbol. It was the second time Clarke had seen that symbol in 2 days, and now it was tied directly to a meeting place and a time. The problem? Saturday night had already passed. A missed meeting. If Bennett had been the intended recipient, then the velvet scrap in the conservatory might have been a failed attempt to signal that the plan had changed. But if someone else had taken his place, the theft could have unfolded exactly as arranged, with Bennett left behind as a distraction. The next clue wouldn't come from the stables or the tunnels, but from an old portrait in the main hall, where Clarke would notice a detail in the painted background that matched one of the secret coves on the new map. The main hall of Ashwood was lined with portraits, faces from centuries past, each watching with the silent patience of oil on canvas. Most guests passed them by without a second glance, but Clarke had learned long ago that art often carried more than one story. The Whitmore patriarch near the base of the staircase hung the portrait of Edward Whitmore, the patriarch who'd built the hall's east wing. He stood in the foreground in full naval attire, one hand resting on a chart table, the other pointing toward the open window behind him. Through that painted window lay a sweeping view of the coast, cliffs, sea, and a small, crescent-shaped cove. A recognizable shoreline. Clarke stepped closer. The shape of the cove was identical to one marked with an X on the coastline map from the satchel. Even the cluster of rocks offshore matched, painted in careful detail. It was not the cove directly below Ashwood, but another about a mile north, hidden from view unless one stood on the old lighthouse bluff. The implication, if the cove was painted into the portrait over a century ago, it meant the Whitmores had known of it for generations, and perhaps used it for the same discreet arrivals and departures hinted at in the tunnel maps. Clarke quietly. They weren't just smuggling in the past. They were leaving a record in plain sight. A witness remembered Mrs. Dalrymple, the housekeeper, mentioned that she'd once seen Bennet and Margaret Vale lingering before this very portrait during the welcome reception. They'd spoken in low tones, and Margaret had pointed to the painted cove with an almost knowing smile. If they had recognized the landmark, the cove might not be just a historical curiosity. It might be where the painting was waiting right now. The following morning, Clarke and Rowan would make their way to the northern cliffs and find fresh boat marks on the sand, along with a single rain-soaked crate stencil bearing the initials SR. The morning broke gray and cool, the fog lifting just enough to reveal the jagged line of the northern cliffs. Clarke and Rowan took the narrow cliff path, the sea on one side, dense brambles on the other. After nearly half a mile, the path opened to a steep descent, a set of weathered steps cut into the rock, leading down to a hidden crescent of sand. Signs of recent activity on the beach, the sand bore two distinct impressions: the drag lines of a small boat being pulled ashore, and the deep, rounded marks of something heavy being rolled or carried toward the cliff base. The tide had already erased part of the trail, but one clear sign remained: a single wooden crate stencil, water-stained but legible. Painted on its side were the initials SR, the same as on Bennet's brass key. The cliffside niche following the drag marks. Clarke found a narrow recess in the cliff, half hidden by hanging seaweed. Inside, the sand was dry, and bits of straw were scattered on the ground, packing straw, the kind used to cushion fragile shipments. No crate remained, but the imprint it had left in the sand was unmistakable. The question of timing Rowan. If they came by boat, they could be anywhere by now. Clarke, unless they're still close, waiting for the right tide. This cove's no good for launching in rough water. They'd have to bide their time. A glint in the sand. As they turned to leave, Clarke's eye caught a glint in the sand near the waterline. He knelt and uncovered a small compass rose pendant, its chain broken. The metal was warm from his hand, but faintly salt-sticky, as though it had been recently dropped. Someone connected to the theft had been here, and not long ago. That evening, a storm would drive a stranded rowboat into the rocks near the cove, and inside, Clarke would find a waterproof satchel containing what might be the final piece of the puzzle. By nightfall, the calm of the morning had given way to a sudden squall. The sea boiled white at the base of the cliffs, and sheets of rain blurred the horizon. It was Rowan who spotted it first, a rowboat half-capsized against the rocks just beyond the northern cove. The waves pitched it like a toy, but it was lodged between two boulders, kept from washing away by a tangle of ropes and seaweed. Reaching the boat, Clarke and Rowan descended the slick cliff steps carefully, their lanterns shrouded from the wind. At the base, they waded knee-deep into the surf, timing their steps between the crash of waves. The boat's hull was scuffed, its paint peeling in strips. Inside, a pair of oars clattered against the sides with each swell. The waterproof satchel wedged beneath the mill seat was a black waterproof satchel, its buckles stiff with salt. Clarke hauled it free and climbed back to the sand before unfastening it. Inside were three items: a folded oilcloth, stiff and creased; a small ledger, its cover embossed with the compass rose; a single brass key identical to the one found in Bennet's suitcase. The ledger, by the dim glow of the lantern, Clarke flipped open the ledger. Each page listed dates, initials, and descriptions, but the language was coded, using a mix of numbers and symbols. One entry caught his eye: SR, Portrait, Ashwood, 14th moon tide. The 14th had been the night of the theft. The implication Clarke, quietly: SR isn't a person, it's a code for the route. The pieces were aligning, maps, signals, and hidden landings, all pointing to a coordinated network moving items quietly along the coast. But if this ledger named the route, it might also name the final destination and the person who ordered the theft in the first place. The following day, a breakthrough would come not from the cliffs or the hall, but from the lighthouse keeper, who claimed he'd seen two figures rowing under the moon and recognized one of them. The Whitmore estate stood only a mile from the old Ashwood Point lighthouse, a lonely tower of whitewashed stone, its beams sweeping across the restless sea. The keeper, Samuel Hargrove, was a man of few words, but decades of tending the light had given him the habit of noticing what others might overlook. The night of the theft, Clarke found Hargrove at his desk, mending a length of rope. When asked about the 14th, the keeper's brow furrowed. Hargrove: moon was out, though the fog lay low on the water. Round midnight, I saw a light. Not the moon, not a star. A lantern. Out past the North Cove. He set the rope aside. Two figures in a rowboat. One was pulling hard at the oars. The other, well, I'd swear I knew that profile even in the dark. The recognition Clarke waited. Hargrove looked like Miss Vale, Margaret Vale. The name landed heavily in the quiet room. Hargrove. She's been here before, years ago. Visited with her father. Stood on these very steps, asking about tides and hidden landings. A second clue. Hargrove rose and crossed to a small cupboard. From inside, he produced a glass jar containing a brass pin, its head engraved with the compass rose. Hargrove found this the next morning, caught in the seaweed by the rocks. Figured it fell from one of them as they came ashore. If Margaret Vale had been in that boat, then her connection to the missing painting was no longer speculation, it was direct evidence. But the question remained, was she working with Bennett, or had she replaced him in the plan entirely? That evening, Clarke would confront Margaret in the library, only to have her reveal a letter from her late father that shifted the entire focus of the investigation. The library was dim, its tall windows streaked with rain. Margaret Vale sat at the long table, a folded sheet of aged paper before her. When Clarke entered, she didn't look up, instead sliding the paper toward him with the quiet resignation of someone who had decided the truth was no longer worth hiding. The letter, the handwriting was elegant, ink faded to a soft brown. To my daughter, Margaret, if you are reading this, I am gone. Ashwood Hall holds more than history. It holds debt, not of money, but of promises made in shadow. The Whitmores and I shared knowledge of the hidden routes, but I discovered they had been used to move stolen works in and out of England. I could not stop it, but you may yet. Trust only the compass rose when it points north, a V. Margaret's explanation. She met Clarke's gaze at last. Margaret, my father believed someone in the Whitmore family was behind a network of thefts. He thought the painting here was meant to be the next in a long chain. I came to see if it could be stopped. Clarke, and the boat? The lighthouse keeper saw you. Margaret, I went to the cove to intercept whoever was taking the painting, but by the time I got there, the crate was already gone. All I found was the satchel. The problem. Her account explained the presence of the compass rose pendant, but it didn't explain why Bennett's maps and the coded ledger both pointed to the same night and tide. Clarke, if you didn't take it, someone used the same plan your father warned you about, which means they're still ahead of us. Margaret's letter connected the past to the present, but also suggested the theft at Ashwood was only one part of a larger, ongoing scheme. The next lead would come from the most unlikely place, the Hall's attic, where Rowan would uncover a sealed crate stamped not with SR, but with the initials A.V. The attic of Ashwood Hall was a labyrinth of shadows, a place where dust hung in the air and time seemed to slow. Stacks of trunks, rolled carpets, and covered furniture created narrow paths between relics of decades past. Rowan had gone up to check for any sign of disturbance in the less frequented parts of the house. What he found was far more than forgotten storage. The crate in the far corner, behind a tall wardrobe draped in moth-eaten cloth, sat a wooden crate about the size of a large trunk. The wood was darkened with age, and its seams had been sealed with wax. Stamped into one side, faint but legible, were the initials. A V opening the seal Clarke arrived moments later, lantern in hand. With a penknife, he chipped away the wax and pried up the lid. Inside lay layers of straw, and beneath them, a bundle wrapped in oilcloth. The bundle was lighter than expected, and when unwrapped, it revealed a stack of papers tied neatly with twine. The documents the papers were shipping manifests, some more than 30 years old. Each listed items moved between coastal points, often described vaguely as antique goods or private commission. Many bore the compass rose emblem in the margins. One manifest in particular caught Clarke's eye. Lisbon to Ashwood Hall, 1989. One oil painting, maritime scene, the consignee's name, Alastair Vale, Margaret's father. The implication, Clarke. Your father didn't just know about the network. He was part of it, at least once. Margaret's expression was unreadable in the lantern light. If Alastair Vale had once received stolen works, Margaret's motives might not be entirely as she claimed, and the line between stopping the network and protecting its secrets was growing dangerously thin. Before Clarke could question her further, Rowan would uncover a false floorboard in the attic, and beneath it, a canvas-wrapped frame bearing the exact dimensions of the missing Whitmore painting. While Clarke examined the shipping papers, Rowan's boots crossed a patch of attic floor that gave a different sound, hollow, almost muted. He knelt, brushed aside dust and straw, and found a narrow seam in the wood. The hidden space with a pry bar, Rowan lifted the plank, revealing a shallow compartment beneath. Inside was something wrapped in layers of canvas and tied with twine. The object was rectangular, and the weight suggested wood rather than stone or metal. The frame, when they unwrapped it, the lantern light fell across an empty gilded frame, its edges carved with delicate scrollwork, its interior bare. A small brass plate at the base bore the title, The Arrival at Whitmore Quay. It was the very frame that once held the missing Whitmore painting. The questions it raised. Clarke, if the frame's here, the painting's been removed, which means they took only the canvas. Why hide the frame at all? Perhaps to delay identification, or to replace it with a forgery later. Margaret's reaction. Margaret stepped forward, her voice low. Margaret, that frame's been in the family for generations. My father told me the painting itself was newer added after the original was lost. If that's true, then what was stolen might not be what everyone thinks it was. If the stolen canvas wasn't the true original, the thieves might have taken something even more valuable hidden beneath the paint. A map, a code, a second image. The next step would take Clarke and Rowan into the estate archives, where an old restoration report on The Arrival at Whitmore Quay might reveal exactly what secrets the painting concealed. The estate archives were tucked behind a heavy oak door at the end of a little used corridor. The air smelled of old parchment and linseed oil, a reminder that this was where Ashwood's history had been carefully catalogued for centuries. Clarke and Rowan stepped inside, lantern light sweeping across shelves lined with leather-bound volumes, rolled charts, and boxes labeled in precise handwriting. The search, it took nearly an hour to locate the slim folder marked Whitmore Maritime Works. Inside, wrapped in tissue, was a restoration report dated 22 years earlier. The report described routine cleaning and retouching of The Arrival at Whitmore Quay, but one section had been underlined in red ink. The hidden layer, the underlined note read, Preliminary cleaning revealed traces of an earlier composition. Beneath the current maritime scene, faint outlines suggesting architectural forms, possibly a floor plan or map. Further removal halted at client's request. The client was listed as Alastair Vale. Margaret's concerned, Margaret leaned over the page, her brow tight. He never told me this. If there's a map under the paint, and the network knew about it, that's what they were after all along. The implication, if the painting had hidden a map, and that map revealed the locations of other stored or smuggled works. Its value to the thieves was far greater than the artwork itself. Clarke, which means they won't destroy it. They'll be studying it right now. For the first time, the theft had a clear motive and a dangerous timeline. A clue from the restoration records would point them toward a coastal warehouse in Whitby, its floor plan eerily similar to the second map found in the satchel. Whitby's harbor was a tangle of masts and ropes, the air rich with the scent of salt and fish. Amid the bustle of fishermen and dockhands, a row of weathered brick warehouses lined the quay, their windows boarded, doors heavy with rusted locks. From the restoration file, one address had matched the floor plan in the satchel. It stood at the far end of the row, its paint long peeled away, its sign faded to a shadow of letters. The locked door Clarke and Rowan approached cautiously. The main door was bolted from the inside, but a side alley revealed a smaller service entrance. The wood was soft with rot, and a careful push loosened the latch enough for them to slip inside. Inside the warehouse, the interior was cool and dim, smelling faintly of tar and old rope. Stacks of wooden crates lined the walls, some marked with foreign port stamps: Lisbon, Marseille, Bergen. In the far corner, a tarp covered something large and rectangular. The tarp's secret. Pulling it back revealed a wooden easel, its surface bare but for a faint outline in dust where a canvas had recently rested. On the floor beneath, a scattering of dried paint flakes, the same muted blues and ochres used in the arrival at Whitmore Quay. A single note was scrawled beneath it: too slow. Signs of departure from the attic's narrow window. Clarke could see fresh wheel ruts in the dirt lane behind the house, already softening in the drizzle. Whoever had been here left less than an hour ago. The chase was no longer about searching for clues, it was about catching up. Following the wheel tracks would lead Clarke and Rowan to a deserted rail yard, where a single freight car stood waiting, its door half open, and the sound of shifting wood echoing from within. The rail yard stretched out in rust and shadow, a graveyard of unused tracks and weather-beaten cars. Most were locked tight, but one freight car sat apart, its sliding door pushed open just enough to reveal a sliver of darkness within. Clarke and Rowan moved in quietly, the crunch of gravel underfoot louder than they liked. Inside the car, the air inside smelled of damp wood and iron. Stacks of crates filled most of the space, their markings faded, but still readable. Some bore port stamps, others carried the unmistakable compass rose. Near the center, a larger object sat shrouded beneath a heavy tarpaulin. The tarp pulled back with a careful grip. Rowan pulled the tarp aside, revealing a canvas-wrapped frame, its size a perfect match for the arrival at Whitmore Quay. But when Clarke lifted the edge of the wrapping, the canvas beneath was blank. A switch, Clarke. They've swapped it. This is a decoy. Inside the frame, thin paper shims had been placed where the canvas should be, just enough weight to make it seem real. Beneath the tarp, another clue. A sealed envelope addressed only with the initials MV. The envelope's contents inside was a short note. The original goes where the tide is lowest. Follow the rose. S. Alongside the note, a ferry ticket dated for that same evening. Destination: Greywater Point. The name meant little to most, but Clarke knew Greywater Point was an isolated harbor with just enough traffic to hide a single transfer in plain sight. Racing to Greywater Point, Clarke and Rowan would find the harbor nearly deserted, except for a single moored vessel with its hold, already loaded and ready to depart. Greywater Point was little more than a sliver of dock jutting into a sheltered inlet. A handful of fishing boats rocked gently in their berths, but at the far end, a larger vessel loomed, its name, Mariner's Wake, painted in peeling white across the hull. The ferry ticket's date and time matched the schedule for that very ship. A quiet approach Clarke and Rowan kept to the shadows of the dockside sheds. From this angle, they could see crew moving on deck, 2 men in heavy coats, and a third figure standing apart, speaking with a woman in a dark traveling cloak. The way she tilted her head, the quick precision of her gestures, it was unmistakable. Margaret Vale. The cargo hold, a narrow ramp led from the dock to the ship's hold. Crates were stacked in neat rows, some marked with foreign destinations, others unmarked entirely. The air smelled faintly of varnish and sea salt. Beneath one tarp, Rowan spotted a crate bearing the compass rose and a faint trace of blue pigment on its side. Margaret's presence, Rowan, low. If she's here, she's either delivering it or taking it. Before Clarke could answer, Margaret stepped into view, a leather satchel slung over her shoulder, her hand resting briefly on the compass rose crate as she spoke to the ship's captain. A narrow window. The captain glanced toward the wheelhouse, then nodded once. 2 crewmen began securing the hold for departure. Clarke, we've got minutes, maybe less. The moment for questions was slipping away. If they didn't act now, the Mariner's Wake and its mysterious cargo would vanish into open water. Clarke and Rowan would make a split-second choice, board the vessel before it left, and confront Margaret directly in the middle of the operation. The Mariner's Wake was already humming with the low vibration of its engines. Lines creaked as the tide shifted, and the air carried that unmistakable scent of departure, oil, salt, and urgency. Clarke and Rowan exchanged one glance. There was no time for hesitation. The leap, they moved fast down the dock, keeping low behind stacked lobster traps and coils of rope. When the crew turned toward the wheelhouse, Clarke slipped up the gangway, Rowan close behind. The lower deck, the narrow companionway, led them directly toward the cargo hold. The sound of boots echoed ahead, 2 crew members securing the crates. The crate with the compass rose now sat in the center of the hold, ropes lashed across it in a crisscross pattern. Margaret confronted. Margaret emerged from the shadows near the hold's far wall, the lantern light catching the determination in her eyes. Margaret, you shouldn't be here. Clarke, then tell me where the painting is before this ship leaves port. She hesitated, not with guilt, but calculation. The bargain, Margaret. You want the truth? Help me get this crate off the ship before we reach open water. It's not going where you think, and if it does, you'll never see it again. The question was no longer whether Margaret was involved, but whether her plan and theirs could possibly align in time. As they argued in the dim light of the hold, the Mariner's Wake began to pull away from the dock, the shore slipping slowly out of sight. The Mariner's Wake eased into the channel, its engines rumbling beneath the deck. The dock lights grew smaller until they were just a string of faint glows against the dark shoreline. For Clarke and Rowan, there was no turning back, not without jumping into freezing water in the dead of night. Margaret's voice was low but sharp. Margaret, listen to me, this crate doesn't hold the painting anymore. It holds the key to finding it. Rowan, then where's the real thing? She glanced toward the ceiling, as if the answer was somewhere above their heads. The captain's voice. From the wheelhouse came the muffled bark of orders. The crew began locking the hold, sliding heavy iron bars into place. Margaret, once that door's sealed, we won't get back in without the captain's key. A desperate plan, Clarke scanned the narrow companionway. Clarke, then we'll have to get it before he knows we re-hear. Margaret nodded once. Margaret, wheelhouse, starboard side. He keeps it on a hook near the chart table. The ship was moving faster now, and with each passing second, the cold expanse of open sea was drawing closer. Clarke, Rowan, and Margaret would climb toward the wheelhouse, careful to avoid the crew, but the moment they reached the upper deck, a shadow stepped into their path. The upper deck stretched before them, dimly lit by 2 swaying lamps. The smell of salt spray clung to the air, and the thrum of the engines vibrated beneath their feet. Halfway to the wheelhouse, a figure emerged from the shadows near the starboard railing. A confrontation. The man was tall, his coat collar turned high, a wool cap pulled low over his brow. Even in the dim light, Clarke recognized him, the same crewman they'd seen with Margaret on the dock at Greywater Point. "Crewman, evening, lost your way?" Rowan shifted his stance, subtly blocking Margaret from view. An unwelcome warning, the crewman stepped closer, boots thudding softly against the deck. "Crewman, captain says no passengers topside after departure, especially not the kind who don't appear on the manifest." Clarke kept his tone calm. "Clarke, then maybe you can take us to him. We need to talk." A thin smile flickered at the edge of the man's mouth. "Crewman, oh, you'll see him. But not before we have a chat about what you're doing near that crate. The distraction." Margaret's eyes darted toward the wheelhouse door, then to the narrow ladder leading up to the chart room balcony. One quick glance at Clarke, and he understood. She'd go high, while they kept the crewman busy. Every second on that deck was a step deeper into enemy territory, and the next move would determine whether they reached the captain's key or were locked below for the rest of the voyage. As Margaret slipped toward the ladder, the crewman lunged, and Rowan met him head-on, the struggle sending both men crashing against the railing with the dark waves churning below. The deck erupted into chaos. Rowan and the crewman grappled near the starboard rail, their boots slipping on the damp planks. The mariner's wake rolled gently with the swell, but each tilt made the struggle more dangerous. Margaret's escape. While the two men fought, Margaret dashed toward the ladder, her hand barely touching each rung as she climbed to the chart room balcony. Clarke moved to follow, but the crewman twisted, grabbing at his coat to hold him in place. The turning point Rowan braced against the roll of the ship, then shoved hard, forcing the crewman's back against the railing. "Rowan, we're not here to steal, but if you want to fight, you've got it." A sudden wave pitched the ship sideways. The crewman's grip loosened just long enough for Clarke to break free and sprint toward the ladder. Margaret's success above, Margaret reached the chart room. Through the glass, Clarke saw her snatch something from the wall, a glint of brass in the lantern light. The captain's key. With the key in hand, they had one chance to unlock the cargo hold before anyone realized the switch. But down on the deck, the crewman wasn't finished, and his shouts were already drawing others from below. With footsteps pounding up from the lower deck, Clarke, Rowan, and Margaret would have to race to the hold and the compass rose crate, knowing it might be their final chance to uncover its contents. Before the crew closed in, with the captain's key clutched in Margaret's hand, the three of them ran the length of the upper deck, dodging coils of rope and stacks of netting. The crew's voices grew louder, but the thud of their boots was still just far enough behind. At the hold, the iron lock on the cargo hold door gleamed in the lamplight. Margaret slid the key in, the mechanism clicked, and the heavy doors groaned as they swung open. Inside, the smell of varnish and brine hit them at once. The crate with the compass rose stood where they'd left it, ropes still tight across its lid. Opening the crate, Rowan worked the knots with quick fingers, tossing the ropes aside. Clarke pried up the lid, revealing layers of straw. And beneath them, a rolled canvas bound with a single strip of waxed cord. The hidden truth Margaret lifted the bundle carefully, her eyes scanning the edges. The canvas was indeed the arrival at Whitmore Quay, but the paint was cracked along certain lines, faint traces of another image lurking beneath. "Margaret, this is it. The map's still here." She unrolled it halfway, just enough for Clarke to see the ghostly outline of a coastline, drawn in charcoal beneath the maritime scene, and faint X marks along it. The interruption from the far end of the hold, the sound of boots and angry voices closed in. "Rowan, we've got company. Time to go." Margaret tucked the rolled canvas into her satchel, and they moved toward the aft hatch. They didn't have the luxury of studying the map now, but whatever it marked, it had been worth decades of theft, secrecy, and deception. As they slipped out onto the deck, the cold night air hit their faces. Behind them, the mariner's wake sailed on, but in their hands they carried the key to an even greater mystery. Sometimes, Clarke thought, the end of one case is just the beginning of another.